We're talking about something subtle, almost hidden, but unmistakable. There's a stirring, a spiritual stirring happening across, especially young people, but in particular, young men. And some people see it more than others, but we believe that God is doing something. Today I'm joined by my friend Ed Stetzer. He's a missiologist, author, cultural observer, to really try to unpack and see what is God doing at this time. Ed, it's great to have you with us.
Good to see you again, Mark.
You know, Ed, I remember it was about maybe 3 years ago, I called you up and I said, hey, Ed, I'm seeing something kind of at our church and in Chicagoland that's happening, that's stirring. I don't know if it's just us or if it's happening around the country. And I called you up and a couple other friends that travel. Ed's the most networked person I know. And I said, hey, Ed, are you seeing this? And you told me, if you remember that conversation, you said we're seeing sparks of it. It's in certain places, not widespread, but God is doing something.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, I might have said sparks 3 years ago. I might say brush fires now.
Yeah.
Again, I wouldn't say revival. I like the fact that you're calling this the quiet revival, because that's from the UK report that
Right.
YouGov and the British and Foreign Bible Society did. And I just talked about this. I teach at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University. And so I just went through this with them at the end of last year. And again, we're definitely seeing something going on in the UK. Now, keep in mind, Mark, the UK numbers, like when you hear a shocking growth of, 30, 40%, that might mean 4% of the population grew to 6% of the population. So it's a big jump from a small group. So in the States, we're seeing more of an awakening of spiritual interest, on Easter Sunday. On Easter Sunday, the New York Times ran an article called "The America Wants a God," and then I wrote the one, and that was started their series on the interest in religion in America, and then I wrote the article in USA Today on Easter Sunday, kind of focused on this increased spiritual interest, particularly among young men. And actually in the article, I talked about the quiet revival. So, Mark, I think it's fair to say something's going on, and it's unlike anything. I've been doing religion research. I used to run a religion research company, Life Free Research, right, for 10 years. So for probably 25 years I've been in this space, I've never seen anything like the statistical shifts we're experiencing right now in culture. It's an important time. It's a gospel opportunity.
It is. And, Ed, there's a lot of terms that people use: revival, awakening, stirring. Talk to me a little bit about, from a spiritual perspective, what you think is happening and the labels that you would use to describe it. When I think of revival, Ed, I think of a church that's lukewarm and has to repent and gets a stir and then starts reaching out. I don't think it's that. I agree. How would you describe it?
Well, one of the first things I say, in general, revivals are tied to the word awakenings. And I would say, if you're asking, are we in a revival or in a revivalistic awakening? If you're asking, is this a revival? It's not yet a revival. If it's a revival, you won't really be asking, is it a revival? Now,
Yeah.
you and I've talked several times about what's going on at your church, and I'm at Mariners Church, and we've grown more in the last year than ever before in the history of our church. I mean, it's really, God is up to something. There are brush fires of this on college campuses, on certain churches, but if there's a revival or a great awakening like revival, it'll be everywhere, and people will be talking about it everywhere. And when we look at the numbers, I've been on this tour. I'm the dean at Talbot, and for kind of a Talbot thing, we've been doing this tour, the Lead the Way tour, talking about the state of the church. And actually, we see for the first time, we see some turnaround in church attendance. It's only in one data set. It's in Barna research, but I have confidence in Barna's methodology. But a turnaround means that the church attendance rates are back up to where they were in 2018. So again, it's important that we recognize that a revival wouldn't look like these, these minor changes that would be substantive. But again, can I just celebrate that there's an openness, there's a spiritual openness that's there. So when you use the word awakening, and I'm just one guest on your podcast, so I don't know how you're using the word awakening in other contexts. I would certainly say there's an awakening to spiritual interest. So in September of last year, I wrote an article for USA Today. And I actually talked about, for the first time, we're actually seeing some church attendance numbers starting to shift. And the example I gave was, I tried to give some examples of like people they'd know, like Canadian musician Grimes talks about re-engaging her faith, or I talked about Chris Pratt and Joe Rogan and a political commentator people wouldn't know. So, but again, everyone's sort of noticing that there are people who you wouldn't have thought are considering Christianity. And I'm not saying those people were all Christians, but they're starting to consider Christianity. So some people call it a vibe shift, but I think there's a spiritual openness. An awakening is a fine way to put it, but I'd say it's an awakening of spiritual openness. I wouldn't put it in the category of like a great awakening, first or second, or anything of that sort, or even the awakening we saw in the Jesus People movement, though I'm sure hopeful. Because, the reason I'm hopeful that we'll have another Jesus People movement is culture is not as divided as it was in the late 60s and early 70s, but it's getting close. And I think it's probably, our culture division is probably going to get worse before it gets better. And unfortunately, I don't like cultural division and all that it comes with, but that's often something that correlates with revival and outpourings. And so that's what I'm hoping for. And those brush fires are giving me a greater sense of hope. My concern is if everyone rushes to say, we're in a revival, I think that causes people. I mean, here's the thing: what you and I are passionate about, man, we need people talking about Jesus. So not sitting back saying there's a revival, bring them to church. We need people, Christians, showing and sharing the love of Jesus every day. You're at Moody. Like when I was the interim pastor of Moody Church, I'd sometimes preach, man, we can't not be passionate about evangelism if we're at Moody Church, and you can't not be passionate about evangelism if you're at Moody Bible Institute. So you want a revival? Let's get all God's people sharing the gospel, and let's see what the Lord does.
I love that, Ed.
I got to preach.
No. Come on. Ed, I've known you for a long time. I love the fact that you are passionate like I am about the gospel of Jesus Christ and shedding it, spreading it to everybody. Let me ask you this question. There's sociological factors, and I don't separate those from spiritual because God can use, things that have happened like COVID and so forth. But when you see especially young men, and some people are saying it's the first time, I don't know if it is, but the first time in history, but young men that especially are coming to church, awaken. Talk to me about what you think is the driving force. I mean, God is stirring, yes. What are maybe some of the sociological factors that you see that have set young men up to pursue spirituality?
Yeah, and let me say that you said some are saying, I think pretty much it's the consensus now that there's something going on with young men. There's also the consensus that for the first time, more young men are going to church than young women. Now, there's been some misstating of these stats on one of the major cable news networks that said that, now more young people are going to church than older people, and that's not true. It's never been true. Matter of fact, I mean, Gen Z is less religious than millennial, and millennials are less religious than Gen X, and Gen X less religious than boomers. What's happening, though, is that there is a shift when it comes in and around men and women. So, every year since we have some data that goes back to the 40s, people born in the 40s. I mean, women go to church way more than men. My guess is at your church and my church, more women go to church than men go to church. But what's happened is for the first time in the religion research we have ever, more young men, Gen Z, if you look at Gen Z, it's more young men going to church than young women. And part of that is, just to be honest, part of that is young women are dropping out of church at unprecedented numbers. This should be a serious concern for us. Yeah. But let's talk about this young men opportunity, because your question is why. And I'm writing an article on this. I'm the editor of a magazine called Outreach Magazine, and this will be in a forthcoming issue. I call it the unmooring of young men. So if you've been on a boat, you tie the boat to the shore. It's called being moored. So what happened is young men, the last decade or so, just to realize, particularly non-college educated young men, that this system's failing them. And there's a real crisis in young men. And, I'm the father of all daughters. So I want to champion their voice, want them to be seen and heard. But, they'd say to me, Dad, you need to realize that our teenage, when they were teenagers, teenage boys are not doing well.
Yeah.
And when you start looking at the numbers, I mean, it's pretty consistent. We both work at universities. Typically universities are now 60% women and 40% men. So young, and I'm not saying there's a lot of challenges being a young woman in our world today, but being a young man, you're just wondering, what's my opportunity? What's my future? And the world as it's been created is not working for you. So you're looking for something else. So you're unmooring yourself from the promises of modernity, the post-World War II consensus, this idea of inevitable progress. And you're like, okay, so what do I do now? So now young men are trying to find something. People always need to moor to something. You have to have something that helps establish your identity. And young men, and so I would say, let me be clear, many even Gen Z young men are considering faith and some coming to church. But I think far more are actually mooring themselves to Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes and some of the worst of the manosphere, as it's called. I think more of them are mooring themselves to Joe Rogan, which I don't put in the same category as those other two,
right,
but to Joe Rogan or to Jordan Peterson. And what I want them to moor themselves to churches, to hear the good news of the gospel, to be discipled in their Christian life by older men speaking into younger men. So I think there's real opportunity here. But I think the reason we're here is because there's the crisis in young men. And Mark, I'm not even sure we're close to the fullness of this crisis. Elon Musk every day, he's putting satellites in orbit, but the big thing he's working on is a self-driving car, right? So remember, 3 million men, almost all men, mostly young men, drive truck. And there'll be a day when Elon Musk announces we don't need drivers anymore. And then you've got widespread unemployment, particularly for non-college educated young men. So I think the crisis of young men is one of the great concerns of our day. Do you really want millions of young men unsure about their future and unemployed and more? But I also think that's why some of them are saying, man, I need something else than the world promises. And man, that's where we tell them the good news that Jesus died on the cross for their sin and in their place. And they can receive by grace and through faith the gospel. And then their life can have meaning, not chasing after some of these other things they're mooring to. But again, on Christ, the solid rock we stand.
Yeah. No, that's good insight, Ed. So the job uncertainty, the where do I fit into the world, I would add to that even the erasing of gender distinctives that have happened in the world. So what is a man? What is a woman? There's just less clarity. And and there is a searching and a dangerous, like the Tates and the Fuentes, a dangerous extremism that I've also observed that is really starting to catch on. I think it was starting to happen some years ago. I remember my son when he was in high school. He said, "Hey, Dad, you want to go downtown to this auditorium and listen to Peterson?" The Canadian guy, what's his?
Jordan
Peterson. And I said, I hadn't even heard of him at that time. And I went downtown and the whole auditorium was full, mainly of young men.
Yes.
And here's a guy just on a stage talking, no band, just a middle-aged talking, a packed out auditorium. And I looked around, I was trying to figure out what's going on here. But he was talking about discipline, about order in their life, and I felt like what's drawing these young men? And I thought to myself, a lot of young men that are just kind of aimless, drifting, and needed some direction. Let me ask you this, Ed. As young men are gravitating towards identity, purpose, what is a man, and they can get sucked into some of these extreme sort of dysfunctional versions of manhood, what do you think the church should be doing at this point in time?
I'm kind of of the view that leaning in on what it means to be a man, leaning in on the ideas of and here's part of the problem. Mark, you and I have been around a little while. 15, 20 years ago, we had some prominent preachers say, we're going to teach everybody to be a man. We're going to man them up and we're going to toughen them up. And all those ministries have imploded and blown up and left a trail of destruction.
Yes.
So being a jerk, and is not
Right.
the answer to
Right.
the biblical manhood crisis. But what does that look like? But here's the thing: I think people are almost like maybe they're afraid to say, to call people to act like men, and I would say that's a mistaken response to the foolishness of some young men, or not so
Right.
young men, 15, 20, 10 years ago. Instead, I think that one of the things that we're both at universities again. We're having conversations with young men at the university saying, well, what does it mean to be a godly man, to be a role model? I think, and again, let me say, again, I don't put Jordan Peterson in the same category as Joe Rogan or Tate or Fuentes. He's a whole different category.
Mhm.
But, should young men need to learn their 12 rules for life from, a Canadian psychologist who's unsure about his own faith? By the way, his wife's not, and his daughter's not. So let's keep praying for Jordan Peterson to come respond to Jesus. He keeps getting close to these things. But again, and I'm just saying, so I'm not anti Jordan Peterson. What I am saying is that we shouldn't have to go outside the church to hear things like a call to discipline, a call to responsibility. These are what men have called men to for as long as men have been calling men to stuff. So what I would say is don't overact, because I think sometimes, and again, keep in mind, with this huge dropout rate for young women, I want men and women to come to church and say,
Right.
man, we're seen and we're heard. But you don't make them seen and heard by treating them like they're the same. I mean, men and women are different. They have different, it's not just different biologically, but that leads to the way we engage the world differently. And to say, this is how we do that Christianly. What does it look like to be a man who thinks and acts Christianly? Man, what better place to do that? And a lot of what Jordan Peterson says, and again, this is not a blanket endorsement of everything Jordan Peterson says. A lot of what Jordan Peterson says sounds like the book of Proverbs. It sounds like some of the things that we should be saying, but in a Christ-centered, in a gospel-centered way.
Yeah.
So imagine good principles like you're hearing, maybe some of the principles from Peterson and others, but then in the context of sacrificial leadership, of laying down your life for Christ, and if you get married, laying down your life for your wife, all that makes such a difference. So we have the truth. So let's disciple and speak into young men.
Ed, you've seen a lot of movements come and a lot of movements go, and they all had their space and place. The seeker-sensitive, the attractional movement, and again, all those were in a certain context and a certain culture. What I've observed, at least in the context here in Chicago, and I still preach almost every Sunday at a location, but I've been pleasantly surprised at the response, especially of young men and women, but a lot of young men, when the gospel is presented unapologetically, clearly, Jesus, Lord, repentance. It's not kind of what maybe 20 years ago, the fear of being too strong, kind of just bring them in. It feels like the clearer, the stronger, the more lay down your life, clear repentance. This means the amount of young men that I'm talking to that are living with their girlfriends, and I challenge them right up front, hey, bro, you need to get married and you need to do this right before. And the ones that are just responding and getting married within the next week is encouraging to me, because it feels like they're not shying away from a clear, bold call to Jesus. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's true. And you kind of talk about the seeker movement, and I'm not like mad at the seeker movement, folks. I would say that, and the Lord used that. We saw a lot of people come to Christ. But I would say that we live in a different age, a different time, and people are asking different questions. And, so I'm at Mariners Church. I'm teaching pastor at Mariners Church. I'm probably, unless you're in California, you don't know Mariners Church. We're the largest church in California.
Oh, yeah.
And, for us, we started young adult service, which is we were planning at 800, and now we're running 3,500 on our young adult service on Thursday nights. And I would tell you that as a whole, as a church, now Mariners Church would have been a seeker church in the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah.
I think as a church, we kind of believe now that, not that we didn't believe there. I wasn't there before. Current pastor wasn't there before. So it's not against anything people did in the past. But we think that today, people need more clarity, and they're wondering what you think. So we did a series called On the Table. We do it every year. And we take January every year and we talk about the hardest issues that people would not have talked about in church 15, 20 years ago. So we had, we're coming up, we're doing topics on, so like six, so it goes into February. But we've talked about sexuality. We've talked about why does God care what I do with my body? We talked about transgenderism. We did a whole sermon on what that meant. And in a way that wasn't, let's stand up and get everyone applaud that we agree with them. But it's like, there are people in our church who are struggling with gender dysphoria. Here's what's our biblical vision for that. So I would say clarity is kindness. And I would say, I'm not surprised by what you just articulated, that your young men are responding to that call to repentance and grace by faith. There was just an article in the New York Times. Ruth Graham did the article, and she talked about young men being drawn to Eastern Orthodoxy, which is not a big statistical trend, but in the examples of the churches she gave, there was the case. I'm not actually criticizing her article. It's just sometimes people say there's a trend towards Eastern Orthodoxy. There's not a trend towards Eastern Orthodoxy statistically among young men, but there's certainly some. And the story kind of explained that they were drawn to the challenges that Orthodoxy brings. It's robust. It's got all this stuff. So what I would say is, if your church is sort of tiptoeing through the culture, I don't know if that's the right approach. Now, on the other hand, I don't think the right approach is, and you would draw young men if you get up and you just red pill and just start, yelling about everything and saying, I think ultimately that's not the answer either. I want clarity of the gospel. I want the gospel to be front and centered. But I think it's good to, with boldness, call young men to repent and follow Jesus. And I think it's good with boldness to tell your church to navigate the cultural issues of our day with truth and grace.
Ed, you mentioned that you have a couple daughters, and I have a daughter and two sons, and they're a little bit. My youngest son is 26, so he's. But when you think about the disturbing stat that young women are abandoning the church or not coming as strongly as young men are, talk to me a little bit about that. What do you think's behind that?
Well, first, let me say that I do have a couple of daughters, but then I have another one, so I have three total. So I didn't want one of my daughters to listen and say, "Hey, you don't have a couple daughters." I'm not sure the full. I mean, let's talk about, what do you think behind it? What do you think's behind it?
I've talked to a lot of college-age young women that, especially a few years ago, primarily, I felt like I heard a lot of accusations of misogyny, patriarchal, almost kind of like the church was putting women down. And not letting them flourish. Almost, there was a view of the church like, this message does not elevate women or let women flourish, but the church has subjugated. I think it was the distortion. When I look at Jesus, I feel the opposite, but I felt like there was a little bit of that message going on, especially among college-age students or a little bit more educated women. And I don't know if that has been part of the root of it.
No, I mean, I think so. Here's what I ask is, we don't have a lot of research on this because this is a relatively new thing. I think that my professional read, just as someone does research, is that it's partly that. But here's the thing, it depends. Like, people might say that put that kind of in the egalitarian, complementarian thing. But what we don't see is women going to egalitarian churches at a substantially higher level than they're going to complementarian churches. So I don't know. I think that's part of it for some. I think one of the issues is, but again, it's I'm not 100% sure. We need more research on this. Is that there is a correlation, not necessarily a causation, but there's a correlation between ideological conservatism and progressivism and church engagement and involvement. So the more you are ideologically conservative, the more likely you are to be religious. The less you are ideologically conservative, the more you are ideologically progressive, the more likely you are not to be religious. The exception is the African American community, but it's pretty pervasively true. So what we know right now is young men are becoming more conservative, and young women are becoming more progressive. And so I do think it's part of that. And I think too, we would articulate, I think secular young women would articulate concerns about abortion, about, you mentioned patriarchy, those sorts of things. So I think so the problem is I think there's like 5 things going on at the same time. So I think for more secular women who are becoming more progressive statistically, religion would be less of an engagement, period, just statistically. I think for Christian young women, it may be, well, am I seen or can I be heard in this context? And I think like every church tradition, I mean, maybe not everyone, but like almost every church tradition on the spectrum from the most egalitarian to the most complementarian, can find places and spaces for women to see other women leading and engaging and more. Yeah. And so I think when young women come to church and they never see a woman's voice being seen, heard, or valued, and I would say the last thing is it's impacted everybody is, again, because I think there's 5 things going on. I didn't give 5 things. I made up the number 5. But another thing going on is we do see some data that the response to sexual abuse scandals has been particularly impactful on women's view of church as well. Yeah. So I would say, I think that, can I just rejoice that young men are coming back to church at a higher level? Yeah. But simultaneously, I'm concerned, and I know you are concerned. And so how do we engage young women? And it's interesting because, in America, this is American phenomenon I'm talking about here, but in Korea, it's the same thing, but like 2 times worse, where young men are becoming much more conservative, young women much more progressive. And in Korea, it's actually part of a demographic crisis because now they're not getting married. And so we want to see, in both cases, young men and young women find a welcome home in church, find a safe place for them to thrive, a place that they feel valued, both men and women. And so I think we have work to do, but I'm not discouraged by the opportunity. I'm discouraged by some of the stats, but I'm encouraged because Jesus still, well, I'm always encouraged because I've read the end of the book and Jesus wins. But I'm encouraged because I think people are hearing some of these things about young women's dropout, which is higher than we've ever seen before, and saying, what are we going to do to address this? I want to address it in biblical ways and do it in ways that honor the Lord.
Yeah. Great insight. When you look at awakenings, revivals historically, just focusing on North America for now, is there any period of time that what we're going through right now that you would say this is similar to, or this has some of the same characteristics of? Is any? I know you mentioned the 60s a bit, and
yeah. No, I've written on this. I think this is very important. There's an article by David Brooks in The Atlantic. He's a relatively new follower of Jesus. He wrote this article, and he says every 60 years, America goes through what he calls a moral convulsion. And he didn't write anything about, as I recall, anything about religion in the article, but I had a conversation with him with some students. And you can map the American convulsions with spiritual movements. So let's go back to 1968 and just see. I was living in Chicago in 2020. I was at the Moody Church in 2020, pastoring there. You were serving in the city. So let's think back to 2020 and map it over 1968. So 1968, there were civil rights protests. There were Vietnam War protests. There were assassinations. Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968. Bobby Kennedy was there as well. It felt like the whole country was falling apart. There were riots. There were all these things taking place. And it's sure, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. And it sure sounds a lot like the 2020 and the last few years. And here's an interesting fact, actually. In 1968, there was a global pandemic. Your grandparents would have called it the Hong Kong flu. I think it's H3N2 as we call it today. And what's funny is they didn't shut everything down in 1968. They actually started planning Woodstock, which seems like a strange decision to slow the spread of disease. But again, so in the last time we had a cultural convulsion, which history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme, which feels a lot like our last few years. It's been less violent, I think, and this is one of the reasons I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think we're going to see more violence. We're going to see more division in the culture. But in 1968, in the midst of the peak of it, there's a pastor in Southern California that his church is about 11 miles from where I live. And he said to his daughter, I want to meet a hippie. And she brings home a hippie, and this hippie and this pastor start a Bible study, and it grows to dozens, hundreds, thousands. And then eventually 20 to 30 million people trace their spiritual heritage to the Jesus People movement. That in 1968, Chuck Smith and Lonnie Frisbee, and Lonnie Frisbee's life is complicated. So for me, I do think this. So this is why, though, I think it's. I'm really careful about using the word revival, and I appreciate you putting the word quiet in front of it, which I think is reflective of what is going on in the UK. But if there's going to be a revival, it's going to be because this unmooring of all these people, like it's not just young men, but the failure of the modern experiment.
Yeah.
The people are going to be like, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And here's the thing: not all of them are going to come to church. Some of them are going to go do weird things. I mean, movements, revivals are messy. I mean, everyone loves the Second Great Awakening. You're like, oh, praise God for the Second Great Awakening. Let's remember what came out of that: Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, all of this different stuff comes out of the Second Great Awakening, and so you're going to see some weird stuff come out of it. But to me, like when I look to 1968 and I look at 2020 to 2025, I'm like, man, we have the cultural, sociological stew cooking that could produce a significant movement of God. And I'm actually of the view. Now, again, you got to remember, like Mark, we know each other a while. If you talked to me about research 10 years ago, I'd say to people, stop saying evangelicalism is dying, because it's not. There's no statistical evidence of that. And I was like, always, I was sort of known as the research debunker for fake stats. Well, and now what I'm saying to people is, don't start announcing a revival. That would be over-exaggerating the situation. But something is clearly going on in the data, unlike anything that we have seen for as long as we've done religion research. The slow decline of religion in America has plateaued in some ways, might be turning around in some ways. Young men are leading the way. There's great gospel opportunity here. But I got to tell you, you're not old enough and I'm not old enough. Man, it was tough being a pastor and a church leader in 1968. So all those wonderful students at Moody Bible Institute and the Talbot School of Theology, like they're going into a pastoring time that's very divided. People are very triggered by everything. But it also could be the very time that leads to a revival. So let's be faithful to God's call. Let's stay biblical. Let's, in the power of the Holy Spirit, live on mission. And then we'll look back 5 years from now if there's a revival and say, man, we didn't lose it in the midst of the revival. Because we've all seen, Mark, we've seen pastors and church leaders just lose it the last decade, going to the left, going to the right. It's like, what happened to the focus on the gospel? Let's be sure that we steward our time and our leadership well.
I love that, Ed. One last thought I'll mention is our friend George Sweeting. He was the pastor of Moody Church before he became the president of Moody Bible Institute. And he passed away recently, almost 100 years old. But he told me that he remembers pastoring Moody Church in the 60s when all this was happening.
Oh, wow.
And how convulsive it was looking out in the street, and the riots in Chicago was in the midst of a lot of stuff. But we also saw a huge harvest. And I'm praying with you and many others that that's what we'll see. But thank you for the reminder that it gets worse, and probably to expect it to get worse before it gets better. But sometimes in the midst of great disruption is where God moves in powerful ways.
That's right.
Hey, folks, you've heard from Ed Stetzer. Ed, it's always great to be with you. Love your tentacles in a lot of what's happening around the world. And I know you're a careful observer of culture and spirituality and how they mingle together. So appreciate your insights on that. We'll be praying together that God will do something that will astound us in this next generation. So God bless you. Again, thank you for being on the program with us today.
Thank you.